How's it going, church folk? This is another AND Campaign Civic update with Justin Giboney, where we are trying to raise civic literacy among Christians so that as we go out into the public square, we can engage in a more informed and effective manner. Today, I want to talk a little bit about America's polarized political environment or landscape. We hear about it all the time, how Americans can't agree on anything. If you're on the left or the right, we're on opposite sides on almost every issue, and it's something that we really need to address. But how I want to address it today is through data. Is to see what the actual data has to say about it. A group called More in Common, along with YouGov, they collaborated to recently release a scientific study about America's polarization and really about our social division. It was called Hidden Tribes. And what the researchers wanted to find out here was, what was it that was dividing Americans, and how can we start to come together to actually get things done? And I finally got a chance to review it. It was really fascinating. Coming from my work, doing a lot of campaign management, you can hear a lot of anecdotes about why something's happened, but you want to get to the data. People can say anything they want, but you want to see what the data says about what people are feeling, what they're responding to, and things of that nature. And this provided a treasure trove of data for us to look at. When you're looking at data, though, one of the things that you want to take into consideration is the sample size. How many people were actually took part in this questionnaire? How many people were part of the study? So say if there were only 17 people or 70 people who were part of this study, it may not be actually representative of Americans in general. You want a much larger sample size than that. This particular study had a sample size of 8,000 Americans, which is pretty healthy. You also want to look at something like demographics. How many of a certain type of people did they interview? As far as demographics go here, 67% of the sample were white Americans, 12% of the sample were black Americans, 12% were Hispanic Americans, 4% were Asians, and it was almost 50-50 between male and female. One of the conclusions that was drawn from this is that America's differences have become dangerously tribal, that our culture is fueled by outrage. Is a culture of outrage where everyone is taking offense. And what the research was able to do was to take people's core beliefs, the core beliefs of Americans, and take that information and break Americans down into 3 tribes. Here are the tribes that they broke it into. Progressive activists, which are the furthest on the left, they were 8%. Traditional liberals were 11%. Passive liberals were 15%. The politically disengaged, meaning people who just weren't engaging at all, were 26%. Moderates, where I found myself, were 15%. Traditional conservatives were 19%. And devoted conservatives were 6%. One of the interesting things about this study was that the 2 smallest groups, which were progressive activists all the way on the left and devoted conservatives, which were all the way on the right, were actually these were the smallest groups, but they actually had an outsized voice. In many ways, they were dominating our public discourse because they were the most active, they were the most involved, they were the most willing to go to a rally, to contact their representatives and things of that nature. So the smallest groups on both ends have an outsized voice and probably an outsized impact on our political landscape. I found that to be problematic. Now, something else that was interesting is while these 2 groups disagreed on almost everything, one thing that they had in common is that they were most likely to be white and they most likely to be affluent. So they have a lot in common, but at the end of the day, they were disagreeing on all these different things, which was very interesting. Now, progressive activists, their main issues were climate change, inequality, and poverty. For devoted conservatives, it was the issues were immigration, terrorism, and jobs in the economy. Here's kind of give you a view of some of the differences that these 2 groups had. 91% of devoted conservatives thought that men and women have different roles. Only 15% of progressive activists thought that men and women had different roles. 86% of devoted conservatives thought it was more important for a child to be well behaved than to be creative. Only 13% of progressive activists thought it was more important for the child to be well behaved than creative. This is very interesting if you look into the research and see how this goes back and forth. Now, in the middle of these 2 groups are what the researchers were calling the exhausted majority, people that weren't all the way to the right or all the way to the left. Most of us probably find our space there. We probably find ourselves there in that space, rather. But these people were getting tugged to the left and the right, and because they weren't as bold as others, their voice just wasn't as loud. Something else we can anecdotally look at is when it comes on, when we watch television and the different shows, the people on the far left and far right are more provocative, and so it seems like they get more time, that people listen to it more because there's a entertainment side of all of this too. Something else that was interesting as we close, over 70% of Americans in this study believed that we were too politically correct, that people were taking offense too easily. You make of that what you will. And so I want you all to take the time, if you have time, to look at this Hidden Tribes report. Look at it for yourself. There's a lot of good information in there, but there's something that we should learn, which is that if you are not on one of these extremes, that maybe you should be more bold. Maybe you should be more active, and maybe we can take responsibility for the place that our political landscape is in right now. See you next week. If you want more information like this, you can always join myself and Michael Ware on the Church Politics Podcast every week, where we are bringing you a lot of political commentary and information on a weekly basis. See you next week.